Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to 1938, Halloween 1938 to be specific. And we're going to be talking about the War of the Worlds. Now, Chris, when I think about the War of the Worlds, the first thing that comes to mind is 12th grade high school. I had to read The War of the Worlds. I don't remember much about it. I think I probably skimmed it. I may have even got the Cliff Notes if our audience remembers those things. But I remember that's about all I actually remember of War of the Worlds. But then of course I know the quote history end quote about what happened in 1938 with the War of the Worlds.
Yeah, and I can say that the War of the Worlds, my first recollection of it was in high school also. And it immediately turned me off to science fiction. I
Really?
just, yes, I remember, and I think it was probably because I was forced to,
Hmm.
because just to be candid, science fiction is just not in my thing nowadays. I go back to that, and I remember them playing it was a cassette recording
Hmm.
of the radio broadcast, if you will, of the War of the Worlds. And I don't know. I guess coming from that background of, I was never really into Star Wars and Star
Hmm.
Trek and all of that stuff, and just that whole thing. I love space. I think it's great about the moon and Mars and all, but the whole science fiction and really War of the Worlds, if you sum it up in one sentence, it is, conflict between humanity and Martians.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't quite get to it.
Well, the book we read in high school, and you were a year, Chris and I are the same age, but he was ahead of me in school. Um, the book we read, the War of the Worlds book we read was by H.G. Wells and was written in 1897. I don't know if the versions we read had been updated. I was actually, before we started recording, going around the house trying to find my copy because I know it's around here somewhere, but I wasn't able to find it. So this book is published by H.G. Wells in 1897. It takes place actually in England, of all, when we think of it, we think of something happening in the United States, but no, it took place in England. And then, um, on Halloween 1938, Orson Welles comes along, and with CBS and the Mercury Theater Group, they produce a version of War of the Worlds that is happening in New Jersey and New York. And this is what causes the alleged stir that happens around the nation in 1938. And Chris, the reason I thought about this particular topic, I'm not really a science fiction nerd either, though I do like Star Trek. Um, but the reason I thought about this is because when we're recording this, one of the big things on the news is these drone sightings and other unidentified flying objects or whatever you want to call them in, of all places, New Jersey. And I thought, what a correlation there is between 1938 War of the Worlds and now 2024 Invasion of the Drones, where you have similar type of reactions going on to
Yeah,
stuff
and
we're seeing or hearing in the media. Yeah.
right. And the one thing that goes with that is, I mentioned that cassette recording,
Right.
that we listened to in addition to the book, because, back when this was written, you start having the advent of new technology. And so, in 1938, it becomes a radio program. And what's interesting about it is that, Orson Welles directs and actually stars in this radio broadcast, but it creates panic among listeners because news came from the radio, information came from the radio. And so if you just happen to turn on the radio and you hear the Martians are coming, we're being invaded by Martians or aliens, well, an individual couldn't fast or rewind or, start over or whatever. They didn't know what they were getting. And so for some of these people, they thought that the events were true. They thought that there were truly aliens coming. And you're right, because even today, with all of the technology available to us, and this blows my mind, is that in 2024, we have these sightings of multiple drones and all of the latest technology. You've got an FBI, CIA, NS, all these people, and nobody can trace
Hmm.
what's going on. It just blows my mind because they were able to find the murderer of that United Healthcare CEO on a bus in a McDonald's in far out nowhere, Pennsylvania, and yet we've got 30 drones flying over New Jersey and nobody knows where they're coming from.
Nobody can find them. Yeah, I mean it's very interesting. Sometimes I think it's a matter of what, and I think this is true of us as individuals and us as a nation, even when you're talking about government. Sometimes it's not a matter of whether we can, sometimes it's a matter of whether we want to. How motivated are we to find the solution? In the case of the insurance, United Insurance CEO being shot and killed, I think there's a lot of motivation to get that. I think when it comes to the drones and stuff in New Jersey, I think for whatever reason, Chris, there's probably not a lot of motivation. I think there's, and maybe it's a little naive on my part, but I think there's a level at which we like the humans like the idea of a mystery. Humans like the idea of the unknown. We like the idea of it's like we're living in a real life sci-fi movie and that kind of thing. And I think that's one thing that connects things like War of the Worlds, drones in 2024, the Lost Colony, and these other things. I think we as people, we really like mysteries.
Well, and we do. We like mysteries not being solved.
Right.
We like to keep the theory going, which is why there is such great debate if the UFOs are present and what are these unidentified flying objects, Area 51, all of these things. And and I think when you go back, we have to go back to when this was, when this was written, because it's written in 1898. And as it's written, one of the things I found interesting is that some people today believe that the book was encouraging viewers or readers to question this idea of imperialism, this idea of countries, going after other countries and taking over and become, this dominant country. And I think that in 1898, 2024, we still have issues with that. We look at what's taken place with Ukraine and Russia. Now we're looking at Syria and what happens to Syria, who becomes involved in Syria. So, this War of the Worlds book is still relevant today because it is still a war of the worlds, maybe in the sense of global, but also in space.
Yeah, and thinking about it in 1938 or not 1938, yeah, 1938 when War of the Worlds aired on the radio. You got to think, I'm not sure off the top of my head what year was radio invented? Do you remember off the
I
top
mean,
of your?
it was the early 1900s, I
Yes,
mean,
it's not that old.
no.
In 1938, technology like radio is not old technology, and you have people still trying to figure out what is it? Is this, what is real, what is fantasy? I remember my grandmother, she passed away in 2000, and she once told me, she was a really big soap opera person. Loved to watch her soaps, her stories, and she once told me that, I don't know what year this would have been, but she once told me that in watching a soap opera, somebody got killed on the soap opera, and she was so upset because she thought they had been killed in real life, and I think there's some correlation here with that, with 1938, what's really happening. We're hearing this on the radio, what's really going on. And also today, people see stuff on the internet, on Twitter, on Instagram, or whatever. And I think there's still that trying, and with the rise of AI and all this stuff, I think people are today, just like then, trying to sort of figure out what's real, what's not real. How do we make sense of this new technology that's exposing us to things that maybe we haven't been exposed to before, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense in what you're talking about because, let's think about this. And when you selected this topic, at first I was like, I really don't know where to go with this.
Mhm.
But then I started just kind of digging into it, and you mentioned some things off the air, and so I started going back, and one of the things that we see and is this idea of um, Wells in the War of the Worlds talking about this theory of survival of the fittest, in which you've got this battle between the Martians and those on Earth. And the Martians are older, which means that they're more intellectual. They have this superior intelligence. They are able to create weapons that is better than anything that can be made on Earth. And it goes back to what you were saying about AI and artificial intelligence. And you start thinking, computers have become smarter than human beings. We now rely on technology for every single thing to the point, don't want to get off on the tangent, but to the point where we have forgotten how to communicate. We've forgotten how to write, how to talk, how to have social interaction. And so now you have this survival of the fittest, which basically is going to be you're either going to jump on technology and you're going to be focused on living your life technology driven, or you're not going to survive. And while that is good to have technology, it's also bad. And here is a man in 1898 who was saying the same thing that we're still saying now.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Is humanity ready to face the unknown? Then it was Martians. There was a real belief that civilizations lived on Martians, but now, like you said, AI. AI is the new Martian. Where are we going with this? I remember I think it's Elon Musk and his company are working on these AI humanoids that they say will be available in a few years to everybody. And I was at a conference and they were talking about this, and I looked at the guy next to me, and I have no idea who this man was. And I just said, I'm not having one of those things in my house as I'm trying to sleep. And that's a little comical maybe, but I think it reflects this sort of we're entering a brand new world just like they were then. Are we under threat from Martians? And today it's are we under threat from AI?
Well, and I go back to that in the fact that when you're looking at the novel, there was a warning where you can have too much um, artificial intelligence, if you will,
Hmm.
and you start losing emotion.
Uh-huh.
You start losing the ability to care and have empathy. And just take politics. And I know we on this episode we're staying away from politics, but really, people hate one another today because they're a Trump supporter or a Trump hater. People do not have empathy for the hurt in the world because we've become so numb to the hurt in the world. And I think that that goes once again to this over use of technology and that we've lost the ability to feel. We see what's happening in the news, that last this just recently there was an attack in Germany at a Christmas festival where a guy drives a car through a crowd that's just trying to enjoy the shops of Christmas. And immediately our thoughts go to terrorism. Our thoughts go to, are there others instead of why?
Hmm.
Why are we to this point where people feel I'm not happy with my health care, so I murder a CEO? I'm not happy with Christmas. So, and I think it does go back to this overdeveloped brain where technology has consumed so much data in our brain that we've lost the ability to simply be human.
Yeah, and while you were talking about that, I was thinking about the United CEO who was shot and how people on Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, and we're celebrating it. And I understand that Twitter's not the real world, that what goes on Twitter is not necessarily reflective of what real people are thinking, but still at the same time, it goes back to what you're saying, this loss of empathy, that the person becomes the killing of this guy becomes more of a strike against a big company than it does the killing of a human being. And I think that goes back to what you're talking about, loss of empathy. But anyway, Chris, I think we've strayed way off topic here. So let's get back to World of Worlds. All real good observations that we've made there, I think. But 1938, Chris sits down with the family. They turn on the radio, and what does Chris hear? He hears that aliens are landing in New Jersey at this particular spot. There was I don't think I wrote down the name of the little store there in New Jersey that was being attacked, and the aliens were landed, and Chris and his family think it's real. What does Chris do?
Yeah, you immediately start locking your doors. You start just preparing for the worst. It's because the Martians are coming. The world as we know it is about to end. And so, it's not like you can get on the computer to verify it and to see if it's
Yeah.
true. You can check all these. All you have is a radio that is telling you this. And depending on when you come into it, depends on how quickly or how seriously you take that particular threat.
Yeah, and I did write it down. The name of the location's Grover's Mill in New Jersey. It's an actual building. It was there then, it's still there today. And that was the supposed landing site. And this was, and I think this is one of the reasons why it so impacted people was because these were real locations, especially if you were in New Jersey that you knew about. These were real locations. So people are hearing this broadcast. It sounds like a news broadcast. They've got actors, they've got sound effects, they've got all of these things, and people are listening to this. And like you said, Chris, they're locking their doors, they're panicking. People in New Jersey, some of those people went out to Grover's Mill there in New Jersey to see what was actually going on. And there are reports that people were actually shooting at the water tower because this water tower maybe looked a little bit like the Martians that were being described in the radio show. And law enforcement show up there, and they're not really sure what to do because you got all these people out there at Grover's Mill, New Jersey, that are there with their guns and stuff, ready to fight the Martians, I guess. But it really scares a lot of people who think, the world as we know it is now under threat. And the interesting thing about this, Chris, is that neither Orson Welles, neither the Mercury Theater Group, neither CBS thought that was going to happen. In fact, Orson Welles was sort of frustrated with the production. There had been a lot of changes and a lot of back and forth, and he was sort of frustrated with it. And some of the actors had reportedly sort of downplayed it, not really thinking much of it, thought it wasn't, not much there. And the reaction, or the alleged reaction of people in the public, I think probably took a lot of these folks by surprise.
Well, he is known for this book with his imagination. They said that, the way that he wrote with such excruciating detail, then anybody that was to listen to this just felt that it was happening. I mean, you're mentioning a specific store in New Jersey. I mean, the details are so precise that you can't help but believe the that it's going to happen. The power of the presentation that he gives just leaves people, not to, oh wow, what a great story or what a great movie, but it's like this is real. This is, I kind of equate it to this stuff that's out there today, this virtual reality headsets and things like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that puts you into that context. I read recently that they're doing this now, where there's a huge, it's like a whole wall where the cinematography makes it think you're at a sporting event, like you're on the front row watching the actual sport event that's taking place. And everything now is designed to put you there as if you are living the experience. And for these individuals, that's what the radio did. And it wasn't a football game, but it was the fact that extraterrestrial aliens, ET,
Mhm.
was coming to my door and was smarter than me, had better weapons than I had, and ultimately was going to dominate me. And it scared people because it was brutal in the presentation and the imagination.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Scared a lot of people. And Chris, one of the interesting things is, and as I researched this, it was pointed out multiple times that at the beginning of the show, there was a what we call it, say a disclaimer that what you're hearing is fictional. But of course, a lot of people didn't hear that. People listening to the show, just like today. I mean, how often do you, before streaming and all that, how often did you start a show 1 or 2 minutes in? you know so there were a lot of people who didn't hear the disclaimer that this is not real, so they're listening to it thinking this is real. You're in North Carolina and you're listening to a radio, CBS, Columbia Broadcasting Systems. You're listening to this and you're thinking, wow, what is going on up there? This must be scary. People are in a panic, and in the next day, the results were so fantastic that Orson Welles, I found a picture of him, and he's really young in 1938. He looks like he may have been in his 20s. I mean, he is a young kid, and he's sitting on a chair in the midst of these reporters as they're asking him all about War of the Worlds, and what happened and what didn't happen, and all of these questions, Chris, were he was facing, CBS was facing, and actually, Chris, it got so serious that the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, is that what's called, did an investigation. Were they trying to create hysteria? Were they trying to create mass panic? And they never charged anybody. The FCC didn't charge Wales. It didn't charge CBS. It didn't charge anybody. They just investigated, or they allegedly investigated. One of the things that I found interesting, Chris, is how much of this really happened versus how much of this was the hype following it.
Right. And, when you think about it, I think one of the things that kind of leads to the outrage and panic is that, the majority of that radio broadcast was presented as a series of news
Yep.
bulletins,
Yep.
which was kind of how the radio let you know that news was happening. And so what you start having is they have to, newspapers then, who are all about sensationalism,
Mhm.
well, they feel outdone by, what's taking place. And so now here they are having to discredit radio and saying, okay, so the War of the Worlds now turns into the war of publications and mass media, if you will, because the radio can't be a source of news and information because how do you know what's really happening? So now you need to buy our newspapers because the newspapers are not full of that. But yet, William Randolph Hearst and, Putnam and all of them, well, they were all about doing the same exact thing. Theirs was in print, his was on the radio.
Yeah, so you've got two different forms of media sort of battling it out. Sort of sounds familiar, doesn't it? We had at one point you had the networks, and then you had cable, and now you've got streaming and social. We see these competitions even today, you know.
Absolutely, to the point where I would even say that the War of the Worlds book, which then was the radio broadcast, has led us to today where we don't trust what we hear or see with all of the information that we have. We don't trust it because I'm pretty confident that there are many people who would say somebody knows exactly who's operating these drones in New
Right,
Jersey. They're
right.
just not telling us.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Two more things before we wrap up that I just found absolutely fascinating, Chris, and I want to get your response to them. The first is Slate did a investigation. They did a deep historical dive on this, and what they estimate is less than 2% of the U.S. population listened to War of the Worlds. That there was a program on, I think it was NBC or ABC, obviously it was one of the two, with this comedian, and that he got more. viewers or listeners, not viewers, listeners than War of the Worlds did. But who remembers the the opposite show? Nobody. At least I don't. Do
Right.
you? No.
Nope.
So that's very interesting in that, this, may have, I think the point is that this was a little hyped after the fact. The other thing,
Well, I was just speak to that first
go
fact
ahead.
though. Just think about this. 2% is what you said, right?
Mhm.
So here we are in 2024. The War of the Worlds has inspired, I think, 7 films.
Mhm.
There's comics, there's video games, television series,
Mhm.
all of this, which started by 2% of
Mhm.
people listening to something. We were not voracious readers in 1898, but what it happened is this book inspired other books about aliens and in science fiction and all of these things. So I think it is interesting that from something of 2%, it just shows you all it takes is one person who can create all kinds of uncertainty in what's going on.
Yeah, the other one, absolutely. The other one was, you think about things will happen in the United States today, and some world leader will comment on it, or people in another country will comment on it. Happened then. Of all people, Adolf Hitler said that War of the Worlds and the panic that happened, or alleged panic that happened, follow it, was a sign of the problem with democracy. I just thought that was fascinating. Here's a man who is, I think, factually one of the most evil, degenerate people on the face of the planet. Is using War of the Worlds to sort of slap at the United States and the people of the United States. That I just thought was fascinating.
Because it goes back to that theme of imperialism.
Yeah.
There's Adolf Hitler who was trying to control all of Europe. And, you had the big enemy, if you will. I'll look at it, Adolf Hitler, if he's using that context, this is just me, just, I guess, verbal diarrhea on what what
Yeah.
what you said there, that Adolf Hitler saw himself as the Martians. He saw the United States as those on Earth, and he felt he had more weapons. He felt that he was smarter. He felt that he could do all of these things, and so that's why he did the Blitzkrieg. That's why he went so fast to try to conquer as much as he could in a short amount of time, because he knew that the United States would catch up to him, or that the world would catch up to him. So, it surprises me that he does say that, but also, once again, he probably listened to just a blip of it. He
Mhm.
probably read just a small part of it, or somebody told him about the story and told it to him in a way in which it boosted his ego and it caused him to then move forward and do what he wanted to do.
Yeah. When I was at grad school working on my graduate degree in history, I had to take a class on the Holocaust. And I didn't want to take the class. We'll just go ahead and say that. Um, because that's not really military history, things like that, not really my thing. But I was always amazed at how careful, Adolf Hitler was in what he wrote, what he put in writing, what he said. Like you're talking about the world catching up to him. I think he was very conscious of that. So anyway, Chris, I think this was a great episode. Covered a lot of ground, went from 1938 to 2024. I looked at a lot of similarities. People say history repeats itself. I don't know if history repeats itself, echoes itself, or whatever, but we certainly see a lot of correlation between then and today. I encourage our listeners to check us out on YouTube. We have a brand new YouTube channel, all 146, with this episode 147 episodes of history you didn't know but should. Chris, I still remember that first episode we did on Spanish flu. I still remember that. Um,
The
that
dark confines of a blue room at
Yes,
college.
yes, yes. It was a dungeon. And 146, it's hard to believe we're that far down the road with this podcast. But please check us out on YouTube. You just search History You Didn't Know But Should. We're on Spotify, also on Facebook. Give us a listen, share, recommend, comment, like, do whatever you need to do. We really appreciate any help you can give us getting the word out about this podcast, and not just our podcast, but other podcasts related to history. So until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.